Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Melton, and this is my presentation on objects and adjuncts. The first thing in the chapter were adjuncts, and I think this is because it really helps shape and gives guidance to how we look at objects later on. So adjuncts are basically additions to a core sentence. You can add or take them away, and the meaning of like the main part of the sentence, the meat of it, really doesn't change. It's optional information, often answering questions like who, what, where, when, why, how, and so on. So I used an image here of a tree to kind of demonstrate that. For example, like the trunk would be the core sentence, and the branches and the leaves are the different adjuncts because they're kind of branching out. But even when like all the leaves have fallen off of a tree, it's still a tree, right? Yeah, good stuff. So adjuncts are either pre or post adjuncts or adverbials, and adverbials are going to be things like coincidentally or and like honestly, stuff like that. So they're basically used whenever there's an intrusion of the writer, like an opinion, like, well, actually, or it's introducing a next topic with a prepositional phrase or something like that. However, not all prepositional phrases are adjuncts, and the book made this very clear to like not just to lazily, get stuck with that kind of definition. And really, the only way you can tell is by looking at the function of it. And I think that these prepositional phrases in general, and since they're such an important part of adjuncts and objects, I mean, that's naturally going to be an issue for any language learner, honestly, in any language. One of the articles I had looked at was talking about how it was kind of, I don't know, I would call the attitude of the writer maybe a little bit, not melancholy necessarily, but because using the quote unquote correct prepositions for a non native speaker is almost impossible, right? Like, I mean, even native speakers will often say something just out of like, there's like a slip of the mind or anything like that. This was described as an English language learner having a grammar accent, and I thought that was kind of a neat way of describing it because it's true, like, those are things that don't necessarily go away, but it's still going to be a very important part of that person's language journey and their identity with that, and I think that's pretty cool. So adjuncts never fall in the middle of a sentence, therefore they are either going to be pre or post adjuncts. Pre adjuncts being those that begin a sentence, and post adjuncts being those that end a sentence. And all of the stuff from the previous slide applies to this with using adverbials and prepositional phrases and so on. And here we have noted again that not all prepositional phrases are adjuncts. That is super important. But overall, which is kind of funny, the author of the chapters that we read really emphasized that even with all of this and with the few exceptions we've seen so far, there is still a essence or nature of looseness and movability with all of this. Sometimes a pre-adjunct won't necessarily make sense as a post-adjunct, but sometimes you can switch them either way and it's completely fine. And I think that is going to be like the second big thing I want to mention, that this will be a struggle for English language learners because they don't have the native ear to be like, oh, that sentence was worded funny, because if you're learning English, you could probably look at a sentence and you're trying to glean maybe like the denotative information and not so much the connotative one, and even that's maybe not the best description. Like, the placement is so difficult, and sometimes the switch is easily made, and sometimes when a switch is made, there's like this jarring effect, and maybe for an English language learner, it's just they're not going to hear a sentence that is ordered in such a way that the effect is jarring. So I thought that was a good, strong word that the book used. So now we're moving on to the object part of the chapter, but first I want to point out that the picture of this slinky should have been on the previous slide, and I apologize for that. This is to support the ideas of looseness and mobility that is exhibited in adjuncts, not objects. Objects are not like a slinky. Forgive me. However, there are two types of objects that were discussed in this chapter, and in turn sentences as verbs as well. And these are transitive ones. Those are ones that have a second noun, which is a direct object, and there are exceptions. Get smaller. And there are intransitive ones, which, again, since it's in verbs, they don't have a direct object or second noun, which are the same things. So, basically, a direct object is like a plain noun phrase, and it doesn't complete a preposition, and it's just grammar stuff, but y'all get me. However, the exception here is that prepositional phrases that occur right after a verb are not transitive, so that's going to be anything like the dog played with the students. Again, prepositional phrases making everything more complicated, but anyway, you would also assume that verbs are transitive or intransitive, and that's not necessarily true. For example, elect is always going to be a transitive verb because you're always electing something or something is being analyzed. Those things will be transitive. However, the book gave an example of the word smoke or the verb smoke and how that is not going to be transitive or intransitive, just entirely. It's going to go either way. So saying that she was crowned queen completes or extends the first object. So it's a completement, or I don't know if you would pronounce that compliment. I've been kind of reading it either way. It's basically spelled complement with an E instead of an I because it completes it. Yeah. So saying that she was crowned queen, queen complements she and what she was crowned. It's just adding more information. But the second sentence adds a new item altogether, so it doesn't complete it necessarily. And we can see that more here in the next slide. Boom, there we go. Here you can kind of see some of the grammatical happenings. Also want to point out here that it is so important to remember that linking verbs also are not transient because they do not have a direct object. So I would try to teach objects and adjuncts by having stuff that's really concrete with things that students are either writing or reading, namely finding examples of the grammar functions like the different types of adjuncts and the different uses of objects in their writing one at a time so that it can be focused on. And if there were no examples, say for pre-adjuncts, then going through and finding places where they could be added. And this would also be a good opportunity for students to maybe read other students' writings and they could give each other help about where stuff could go, you know. It's like when you're editing a paper, sometimes it's easier to have a second pair of eyes looking over it because they're going to see different stuff jump out that you who wrote it maybe wouldn't. Particularly for younger children, I thought maybe this could be done with reading material. I feel like those types of grammar functions are found commonly in children's storybooks. And the bullet I have at the bottom about repetition and conversation is mainly referring to the placement of adjuncts and prepositions. So I think the one way that people are going to get an ear for it is going to really just be hearing it used correctly, consistently over and over. So just in conversations or in explanations, throwing those kind of things in where maybe you wouldn't, and then constantly checking for understanding, if especially with adverbials and stuff, like, you know, be like ironically or coincidentally, and these things that kind of interject, and maybe higher level adverbials that students won't encounter so much outside of the classroom. Yeah, so all of that stuff. I want all of the teaching things to be really authentic and really practical, especially for something as tedious as prepositions, adjuncts, and objects. Thank you all so much for watching this presentation. I hope you learned something, and I can't wait to watch all of yours. So, hope summer's treating you well, and yeah.